Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name written in the private records of the Officio Assassinorum. It appears on kill orders issued to some of the most dangerous operatives the Imperium of man has ever trained. Eversaw killers, Vindicar snipers, who have never missed a shot in their service careers. Calidus agents capable of wearing any face, slipping through any crowd, surviving any environment. All of them have been pointed at this name at one time or another. All of them have come back empty-handed, not because they failed in the conventional sense, not because the target overpowered them, or outran them, or slipped away through sheer luck. They came back empty-handed for a reason that is far more unsettling than failure. They could never confirm that the target actually exists. The name is Orimedes. Now, if you're new to the lore of Warhammer 40,000, that name is going to sound like a joke, and in a way, it is one. A grim, darkly funny pun on the name of the ancient Terran mathematician Archimedes, who once legendarily claimed he could move the world if given a long enough lever. The Imperial Titan princeps who coined the nickname were being sardonic. They had just watched their carefully maintained tactical advantage, the ability of Imperial war engines to outrange Orc gargants, dissolve in a haze of green smoke, and improved weapons systems. Someone had tinkered with those gargants. Someone of extraordinary ability had reached inside some of the most powerful walking war machines the Orc race had ever built and made them better. And whoever had done it had done so with such elegance, such cunning applied so precisely that the princeps found themselves performing a kind of grim salute. They named their unknown enemy after one of history's greatest engineers, and the name stuck. But who is Orimedes exactly? That is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, because the more you pull at this thread, the more you realize that what we are looking at is not just an interesting footnote in the history of the Third War for Armageddon. What we are looking at is a character who, whether intentionally or not, represents one of the most philosophically challenging parallels in all of Warhammer 40,000's vast and sprawling lore. A character whose very existence poses a question that the Adeptus Mechanicus, the great techno-religious order of the Imperium, would find deeply uncomfortable if they ever truly sat with it. Because Orimedes is not just a clever orc. He is not just a good engineer in a green body. He is, functionally, what every tech priest in the Imperium is trying to become. He already possesses what every member of the cult Mechanicus spends their entire life desperately searching for. He has it written in his blood, and they cannot kill him. They cannot even find him to try. He moves through the galaxy like a ghost, leaving behind inventions so advanced that the greatest technological order in human history has quietly begun to study them with barely concealed fascination and more than a little fear. This is the story of Orimedes, but it is also, unavoidably, the story of what a mechboy actually is at the deepest level. It is the story of the Adeptus Mechanicus and their relentless, sometimes tragic pursuit of knowledge. It is the story of two faiths built around technology, two gods of creation who work through their chosen servants, and the deeply strange way those two traditions mirror each other across the great void of species and philosophy. So settle in, let the background hum wash over you. This one is going to take a while, and I think, by the end, you are going to look at both the orcs and the tech priests rather differently than you did before. Let's start where everything in the 40k universe ultimately starts. Not in the 41st millennium, but in an age so ancient that even the Eldar were young. Let's start at the very beginning of the Orc race. But before we get there, I want to say one more thing about what we are about to do, because I think it is important to frame it properly. We are going to spend a lot of time today talking about parallels, about similarities between things that the 40k universe presents as radically, essentially different, about mirrors that nobody asked to be placed in this room, but that are there nonetheless, reflecting things that make the inhabitants of the setting uncomfortable. This is not me claiming that orcs and the Adeptus Mechanicus are the same thing. They are not. Their goals are different, their methods are different, their gods are different, Their entire manner of existing in this universe is different in ways that are meaningful and not trivial. The Adeptus Mechanicus is building towards something. They have a theology of accumulation, of eventual transcendence, of a reunion with the Omnissiah that will complete the quest for knowledge and bring about something like perfection. The Orcs are not building toward anything in that grand eschatological sense. They are expressing their nature. They are being what they are. The distinction matters, but nature and aspiration sometimes converge on the same destination by entirely different roads. And the destination that matters for today's story, a genuine, deep, living relationship with technology that goes beyond learned procedure and ritual and into something more immediate, more direct, more instinctive, is one that both traditions are oriented toward, even if one of them arrived there 60 million years ago and has been sitting in it ever since, largely not reflecting on it, because that is simply not the sort of philosophical exercise that grabs an orc's attention. Orimedes, though. Orimedes thinks. That much seems clear from everything he has produced. Whatever processes occur in that enormous skull, behind whatever organic tissue, and whatever augmentations may have been installed by Grotznik or some other orc surgeon over the decades, there is something that plans across decades, that anticipates enemy responses before they occur, that models the future accurately enough to make 57-year technical investments pay off with extraordinary strategic precision. That is not a small thing. That is a very rare thing in any species. Over 60 million years before the events of the game, a species known to imperial scholars as the Old Ones stood at the summit of galactic civilization. They were beings of staggering intelligence and psychic mastery, stewards of the living galaxy in a way that no species since has even approached. And they were at war, a war that threatened everything they had built, a war against the Necrontyre and against the terrible machine gods those dying people had called forth from beyond reality. Vast, immortal, star-devouring entities of pure energy known as the Satan. The Old Ones needed soldiers, not soldiers they could spare from their own ranks, not allies who might have their own agendas. They needed purpose-built warriors, living weapons, designed from the ground up for a single purpose, to fight and to win, and to keep fighting regardless of the odds. What they created was a race that the orcs themselves call the work of the brain boys. And those brain boys, likely the servants of the Old Ones, or perhaps the Old Ones themselves working through biological intermediaries, did something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the 40k universe. They did not just build a warrior race. They encoded the knowledge of how to be a warrior race directly into the genome itself, not as cultural memory, not as tradition that could be lost or forgotten or corrupted, not as skills that needed to be taught and practiced and could degrade across generations of defeat. They wrote the knowledge into the DNA. Every single orc that hatches from the fungal spores knows how to fight, knows how to grip a weapon, knows at some deep and pre-rational level how the hierarchy of orc society works, who is bigger, and therefore who is in charge. The orc language, such as it is not learned. It simply activates, like a switch being thrown somewhere in the young orc's rapidly growing brain. But the brain boys went further than that. And this is where it gets interesting, because they didn't just encode the knowledge to fight, they encoded the knowledge to build. Section 2. What the Old Ones left behind. Before we go further, I want to sit with the war in heaven for a moment, because the context matters enormously for understanding what the brain boys were trying to achieve when they designed the orcs. The war in heaven was not a conventional conflict. It was not two armies of roughly equal composition facing each other across a battlefield. It was an existential struggle between the Old Ones, beings of tremendous psychic power and biological mastery, and the Necrontyre, a species of dying people who had chosen to trade their organic bodies for deathless metal in partnership with the Satan, those ancient star-devouring entities. And then, as the war deepened and the psychic conflict intensified, a third catastrophe arrived. The warp itself churned into a breeding ground for chaos by the psychic screaming of billions of souls in constant conflict, began producing entities of its own, demons, the ruinous powers, something that neither the Old Ones nor the Necrontyre had intended, and neither could fully control. In this environment, a war fought on multiple fronts, against enemies that were both physical and metaphysical, that could be destroyed and then reconstitute themselves in mechanical bodies, that could call upon the terrible energies of the warp as a weapon. The Old Ones needed soldiers who had specific properties. They needed to be tough enough to fight anything. They needed to be self-sustaining, capable of maintaining their own weapons and equipment without constant logistical support. They needed to reproduce effectively, even under conditions of catastrophic attrition. They needed to be capable of fighting effectively, whether or not their creators were present to direct them. And they needed, ideally, to be immune or resistant to the corrupting influence of the warp, which was increasingly a factor in every engagement. The design that emerged from this set of requirements was the ancestor of the modern orc, the krork, the records call them, larger, more powerful than the current orcs, their psychic field more focused and more coherent, but recognizably in the same lineage. And the feature that was most revolutionary about their design was exactly what we have been discussing: the encoded knowledge, the techno gene, the self-maintaining, self-replicating library of technical knowledge written into the biology itself. It was the solution to the logistical problem of maintaining an army across a galactic-scale conflict, and it was, if you think about it carefully, an astonishing piece of engineering in its own right. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. The Old Ones, these beings of almost incomprehensible sophistication, sat down and decided that their warrior race needed to be self-sustaining. A soldier who can win a battle but cannot maintain his weapons is useless after a generation. An army that requires constant resupply from distant creators is strategically vulnerable. So the Brain Boys solved the problem in the most elegant and permanent way they could conceive of. They made technology hereditary. Not just the general capacity for learning, which every sufficiently intelligent species has. Not just a slightly better instinct for spatial reasoning or mechanical intuition. They created something called, in Imperial scholarly texts, the techno gene. It is a stretch of genetic material that develops as the orc grows, and as it develops, it releases knowledge. Not metaphorically, literally. The orc equivalent of knowing how to breathe or how to swallow food. Encoded in the genes, as automatic as the functioning of a heart. An ordinary orc, the baseline orc boy, who makes up the vast majority of the green tide, receives a basic version of this. He knows how to use his weapons, how to maintain them at a rudimentary level, how to keep his gear from completely falling apart between battles. This is not intelligence, exactly. It is more like competence encoded as instinct. The same way a human infant will reach for food without being taught the concept of nutrition, an orc will pick up a gun and know which end to point at the enemy without having read a manual. But among the orcs there are specialists. The species recognizes that some roles are too important and too complex to leave purely to raw instinct. These individuals are called oddboys, and they develop a deeper, more specialized version of the techno gene. Pain boys, the orc surgeons, are born with a latent understanding of orc biology and anatomy that, while crude by the standards of any advanced medical system, is nevertheless encoded knowledge that they did not acquire through study. The weird boys who serve as the race's psychers have an intuitive relationship with the gestalt psychic field the orcs generate, and the mechboys, the engineers, the builders, the inventors, they receive the deepest, most comprehensive inheritance of all. A mechboy does not learn how to build things. He is born knowing it. He understands the basic principles of physics in some pre-verbal, pre-conscious way that cannot quite be called education. He looks at a heap of scrap metal, and his mind, if you can call it that, and the debate about orc cognition is genuinely fascinating, begins to arrange the components automatically. the same way a human hand might unconsciously reach out to steady a wobbling object. He knows what does what. He knows what fits together and what doesn't, not because he has been taught, but because the 60-million-year-old knowledge of the brain boys is humming away in his genetic code, whispering to him. A young mechboy, fresh from the fungal undergrowth, can look at a broken vehicle and begin fixing it without instruction. He can assemble weapons from component parts with a confidence that has nothing to do with experience and everything to do with inheritance. The knowledge of how machines work is as natural to him as the knowledge of how to walk is to a human child. Now here is where it gets philosophically complex, because this is not quite the same thing as understanding. Understanding is a conscious, interrogative process. You understand something when you can explain why it works, when you can trace the causal chain from cause to effect and articulate each step. An orc mechboy does not necessarily understand why the engines work the way they do. He just knows how to make them work. The distinction matters enormously, and we will return to it. What makes the mechboy extraordinary, and what makes Orimedes extraordinary even among mechboys, is that this instinctive knowledge can be cultivated. It can deepen. A mechboy who spends decades building and tinkering and experimenting does not just accumulate experience on top of his instinct. He begins to unlock deeper layers of the genetic inheritance, layers that were perhaps always there, but needed the right kind of applied attention to surface. The most experienced and skilled mechboys, who rise to the rank of big mechs and eventually mech bosses, have a breadth of technical capability that begins to approach genuine genius. And there is one more element to this that is absolutely critical to understanding the orc relationship with technology, one that the Adeptus Mechanicus finds particularly troubling. The orcs generate a psychic field. They are not individual psychers in the conventional sense. They cannot cast spells or read minds or reach into the warp with conscious intention. What they have instead is a collective, gestalt emanation that grows more powerful the more of them gather together. This field is sometimes called the tide of the green tide, sometimes simply the great bellowing force that accompanies an orc warband, and in large enough concentrations, it does something extraordinary. It makes things work. The orc psychic field has a subtle but real effect on technology in the vicinity of large orc gatherings. It provides an extra push, a psychic boost that bridges the gap between a machine that should work in theory and a machine that actually works in practice. This is why orc technology, which often appears to be assembled from scrap and held together with nothing more than grot spit and optimism, is nevertheless capable of going toe-to-toe with imperial machinery that cost 10,000 hours of ritual maintenance and careful manufacture. The orcs believe it will work, and their belief, expressed through their collective psychic field, makes it so. This is also why orc technology tends to fail when taken out of orc hands. An imperial tech priest who captures an orc weapon and tries to fire it will often find that nothing happens. The gun is no longer bathed in the ambient psychic field that gave it that extra invisible push. Without the orcs around it, it is what it physically appears to be, a barely functional assemblage of scrap. But here is the crucial nuance. The psychic field is not doing all the work. The better the mechboy who built the weapon, the more the weapon relies on actual engineering, and the less it depends on the ambient field to function. A top-tier mechboy builds things that are genuinely, physically, mechanically sound at their core. The psychic field is not a crutch. It is more like a multiplier. A good design multiplied by the field becomes something incredible. A bad design multiplied by the field becomes something marginally less catastrophic. And Orimedes, the evidence strongly suggests, builds things that are genuinely, physically, mechanically sound. His teleporters work, not just for orcs, not just because enough greenskins are standing nearby and collectively believing hard enough. They work at ranges that should be physically impossible. They work with a consistency that goes far beyond anything that could be attributed to the ambient field alone, which means that somewhere inside this enormous, crude, violent creature who answers to Gazghkull and communicates primarily in grunts, and what can charitably be described as aggressive enthusiasm, there is something that goes beyond instinct. There is a mind. But before we get to Orimedes himself, we need to spend a little time with the people who are quietly most terrified of him. The people who have made it their entire civilizational mission to possess exactly what he has. The Adeptus Mechanicus. Section 3. The mechboy. Prophet, priest, and engineer. To truly appreciate what makes Orimedes so remarkable, we need to step back and look at the mechboy caste more carefully. Not just at the raw fact of their genetic inheritance, but at what it means to live that way, what it feels like, as much as we can imagine such a thing, to be a being who knows things without having learnt them. That comparison, the mechboy building the gargant in a vision granted by Krork versus the tech priest activating a titan in the service of the omnissiah, carries more weight the more carefully you examine it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to look at the mechboy in more detail first. There is something I want to address about the way the Adeptus Mechanicus, and through them, much of the imperial scholarly tradition, tends to characterize orc technology. The official line is that it is primitive, that it works through luck and brute force, and the unexplained assistance of whatever psychic field the orcs generate. That it is, fundamentally, inferior to the technologies of the Imperium, and that any apparent exceptions are either misread data or flukes. This characterization is motivated reasoning. It is the kind of thing you say about a competitor when acknowledging their capability honestly would be too uncomfortable. The orcs have been a technological civilization, if we use that term loosely, and we should, because the orc version of civilization has a distinctive relationship with the concept for longer than humanity has existed as a species. Their technical tradition, however irregular it may look, has been producing functioning results across 60 million years of constant warfare against some of the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy. It has not stagnated in the way that the Adeptus Mechanicus's tradition has stagnated. It has not become ritualistic in the way that the Mechanicus's tradition has become ritualistic. Because the orcs do not revere old knowledge. They do not have a database of templates to worship. They have the template in their genome, and that template is interpreted freshly by every mechboy who hatches, expressed through the lens of that particular individual's experience and environment. This means that orc technology is constantly evolving, not directed evolution, not the systematic research and development of an institution with a long-term plan. Something more chaotic and more vigorous than that. The mechboy experiments because he cannot stop experimenting. He builds and tests, and sometimes the test involves a large explosion, but more often than not, something useful emerges. He shares the useful things with other mechboys, not through written documentation. Orcs are not great record keepers, but through the social transmission that happens when mechboys work alongside each other, when they see what each other's hands do and their own hands respond. And over millions of years of this, the orc technical tradition has arrived in some surprising places. Sophisticated teleportation systems, gravitic weapons, advanced force field generation, walking war machines of a scale and destructive capability that matches the Imperial Titan legions, ship drives that allow for faster-than-light travel without the psychological horror of conventional warp entry, orc weirdboy warp heads, who can project accumulated psychic energy as a coherent weapon. None of this is the work of beings without genuine technical capability. Some of it, frankly, represents capabilities that the Imperium does not possess, and none of it emerged from ritual or from STC templates or from a quest for knowledge ordered from on high by a theocratic hierarchy. It emerged from 60 million years of mechboys doing what they do, guided by a genetic inheritance that keeps refreshing the well. Understanding this is essential to understanding Orimedes, because he is not the exception to orc technical capability, he is the summit of it. He is what the mechboy tradition produces at its absolute best, when the genetics and the individual and the specific challenge all align perfectly. He is what the brain boys designed that tradition to produce. Imagine waking up one day with a complete and functional knowledge of electrical engineering that you never studied. Not just the vocabulary, not just the concepts, but the lived, practical, hands-on knowledge. You could rewire a building without a diagram. You could look at a faulty circuit and immediately see the fault, the way a practiced reader looks at a misspelled word and sees it wrong before they can consciously identify the specific error. This is approximately what being a mechboy is like, except the domain is everything mechanical and the knowledge is deeper than you can fully consciously access. Mechboys do not design things with pencils and drawings. They do not sit down and plan. They pick up components and begin building, guided by something that is too reliable to be chance, but too intuitive to be education. The best of them will sometimes stop mid-construction and stare at what they're building with an expression that could be concentration or could be wonder, as if they are discovering what they are making at the same time as they are making it. As if the knowledge is surfacing as needed rather than existing as a stored reference, they can consult at will. This gives mechboy creations their characteristic quality. They are singular. They are not manufactured, not replicated, not built to a standard template. Every weapon, every vehicle, every engine that a mechboy produces is the unique result of that individual's genetic inheritance, expressing itself in a particular moment, shaped by whatever materials were available and whatever problems were currently at hand. Two mechboys given the same task and the same pile of components will produce two completely different solutions, both of which will probably work, neither of which will look remotely like the other. This individualism is celebrated in orc society in a way that is somewhat surprising given how much else about the orc lifestyle emphasizes conformity through hierarchy. Mechboys are weird. They are oddboys. They are, by the standards of orc culture, markedly strange individuals who talk to their machines in ways that even other orcs find slightly unsettling. They form what can only be described as emotional attachments to their creations. Not sentimental attachments necessarily, but genuine invested relationships where the quality of the machine reflects the quality of the mech. And the mech knows this at some deep level. A mechboy's tools are an extension of himself, his workshop, wherever it happens to be. Because mechboys travel with their warboss and work wherever they find themselves, is a space of genuine productivity. Not tidy, never tidy, covered in grease and metal shavings and the carbonized remains of things that didn't quite work out, but productive in the way that a real working studio is productive. Something is always being built. Something is always being taken apart and rebuilt differently. The machines are always talking to him, in the only language he truly speaks. Now, the social position of a mechboy within orc society is fascinating. In a culture that is almost entirely structured around physical dominance, the biggest orc leads, and the biggest orc fights his way there by physically defeating every rival. The mechboys occupy a genuinely unusual niche. They are not necessarily big. They are not necessarily the best fighters, but they are essential in a way that transcends the normal orc calculus of strength. Without mechboys, there are no vehicles. Without vehicles, there are no mass charges. Without mechboys, the guns stop working, the engines die. The elaborate war machines that give a large orc horde its most devastating capabilities begin to rust and seize. Even the most brawl-focused warboss, the most aggressively anti-intellectual orc in the galaxy, understands this at some level. So mechboys occupy a protected position. They are tolerated in ways that would never be extended to an ordinary orc of similar size and fighting capability. They are indulged. Their eccentricities are accepted, sometimes even enjoyed. And as they grow in skill and experience, as the layers of their genetic inheritance unlock through application, the best of them accumulate something else that goes beyond technical knowledge. They accumulate status. They accumulate something that, in any other context, we might call wisdom. Not the wisdom of the philosopher, not the wisdom of the sage who has contemplated mortality and beauty and the nature of consciousness. The practical wisdom of the maker, who has built 1,000 things and knows intimately which ones worked and why, and which ones exploded in everyone's faces and why. The biggest, most experienced mechboys, who take the rank of big mech, lead their own mobs of lesser mechboys. They direct the technical development of entire warbands, in particularly technical clans. They can lead full-scale military operations, commanding not just the engineering corps, but the entire force, because their mastery of the machines that define the battle gives them a strategic picture that purely combat-focused orcs cannot match. And at the very pinnacle of this hierarchy, among the most technically capable and experienced mechboys in a galaxy full of orcs, we find mech bosses, individuals whose technical mastery has grown to a point where they can tackle engineering challenges that would defeat any conventional approach. Individuals who build things that should not work and make them work anyway. Individuals who look at problems that have confounded lesser minds and see solutions that seem obvious only in retrospect. Orimedes is one of these. He is, by the account of all available evidence, one of the most gifted individuals of this kind in the entire history of the orc race, not just because his inventions work, because of what they are, because of the ambition of them, the scope of them, the sheer reach of the engineering challenges he has decided to tackle and apparently solved. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can appreciate the summit, we need to understand what the summit is being measured against. And for that, we need to cross the great void of species difference and land on a rust-red planet, circling a distant yellow star, and meet the people who have decided that the pursuit of knowledge is the highest form of worship. We need to visit Mars. Section 4. The Rust-Red Priests of Mars. There is a passage in the doctrines of the cult Mechanicus that is worth reciting here, because it captures something essential about the gap between what the Mechanicus aspires to and what it has become in practice. The universal laws state that knowledge is the supreme manifestation of divinity. They state that all creatures and artifacts that embody knowledge are holy because of it. They state that the pursuit of this knowledge is the highest purpose of a sentient being, above comfort, above survival, above all other concerns. These are genuinely beautiful statements of principle in their way. They describe a civilization oriented toward understanding, not conquest, not pleasure, not mere survival, but the comprehension of the universe's deepest truths. The machine god, in this theology, is not an angry and demanding deity who requires blood sacrifice and ritual submission. He is the principle of comprehension itself. He is what you approach when you understand something completely, when the veil of ignorance and approximation falls away and you see the true nature of a thing directly. The problem is that the current practice of the Adeptus Mechanicus has, in many ways, replaced the pursuit of comprehension with the performance of comprehension. The rituals of maintenance, the application of sacred oils, the chanting of specific hymns, the performance of prescribed sequences of actions in exactly the right order, are in their origin attempts to create the mental conditions under which genuine technical understanding can operate. They are attentional practices. They are methods of focusing consciousness so that the practitioner can perceive what is actually happening in the machine, rather than what their assumptions tell them should be happening. But over 10,000 years, the practice has calcified. The original intent has been lost in the accretion of tradition. Now the ritual is the point. The performance is the devotion. The correct execution of the procedure is the expression of faith. And a tech priest who achieves correct execution of the procedure is considered to have done their job, regardless of whether they understood anything in the process. This is the deep irony of the Mechanicus' situation. They worship knowledge. They have built their entire civilization around the pursuit of knowledge, and they have ended up with a tradition that, at the level of everyday practice, is profoundly uncomfortable with genuine understanding, because genuine understanding is dynamic and unpredictable and does not follow prescribed procedures. A tech priest who truly understands a machine can repair it in novel ways, can respond to new failure modes, can adapt when the machine does something unexpected. But this kind of dynamic, Adaptive response to novelty is exactly what the Mechanicus's ritual structure is not built for. The rituals work for the expected. They fail for the unexpected. And in a galaxy where everything is in a state of perpetual crisis, the unexpected is the norm. The Adeptus Mechanicus has, over 10,000 years, become extraordinarily good at maintaining what it has and extraordinarily poor at responding to what it does not. The quest for knowledge, the recovery of STC templates, the search for lost technologies, is in part a response to this problem. If they can find the templates, they can add to the ritual library. They can expand the set of things they know how to make, but the fundamental structure, the reliance on procedure over understanding, does not change. Now, this is the context in which we must place the Adeptus Mechanicus's relationship to the orc mechboy, and to Orimedes specifically. The Adeptus Mechanicus is one of the most distinctive organizations in the entire Imperium of Man. Officially, they are a subject institution, bound by the ancient Treaty of Olympus Mons to serve the Emperor's will and provide the technical knowledge that keeps the vast machinery of imperial civilization running. In practice, they are something closer to a parallel state, with their own culture, their own religion, their own chain of command, their own military forces, their own agenda. They worship the machine god. Or rather, they worship knowledge itself. And they believe that knowledge is the highest expression of the divine. Their creed holds that there is a supreme being, the Omnissiah, who exists as the living embodiment of all knowledge and technology in the universe. The Emperor of mankind, in their theology, is the physical manifestation of this Omnissiah, the divine principle of knowledge made flesh. Other, more radical factions within the Adeptus Mechanicus believe the true machine god sleeps beneath the sands of Mars itself, bound there in ancient times. This is technically heresy, but is believed quietly by rather more tech priests than the official theology would suggest. The 17 universal laws of the cult Mechanicus codify this creed with rigorous detail. Knowledge is the supreme manifestation of divinity. All life is directed toward the acquisition of knowledge. The flesh is weak, fallible, prone to error. The machine is perfect, precise, eternal. The path of the tech priest is the replacement of the inadequate organic with the perfect mechanical, the progressive transformation of the self from meat to metal in pursuit of greater cognitive capacity and physical capability. A newly initiated tech priest might have only a few mechanical augmentations, a data port here, a replaced eye there. A senior magos might be more machine than human, walking on articulated mechanical limbs, their remaining organic tissue kept alive within a carapace of metal and polymer, their cognition supplemented by data stacks of extraordinary capacity. They pursue what they call the quest for knowledge. This is their central mission, the great work that organizes their entire civilization, and its most specific and most sacred goal is the recovery of standard template construct databases. The STC, the standard template construct, was the crowning achievement of humanity's golden age, the dark age of technology, that period before the long night of the age of strife, when human civilization reached heights it has never again approached. The STC databases were comprehensive libraries of technological knowledge, how to build starships and power armor and engines and tools and medicines and weapons and everything else a colony of humans might need, all encoded in templates that could be fed into fabrication systems and executed without requiring the builders to understand what they were building. A colony ship equipped with a functioning STC and the resources to work with had everything it needed to establish and maintain a self-sufficient civilization without expert knowledge. Almost all of these databases were lost during the Age of Strife. Fragments survive, scattered across the galaxy in ruins and derelicts and forgotten archives, occasionally discovered by explorator fleets, always treated as objects of profound religious significance by the Mechanicus. A tech priest who recovers even a partial STC template can win elevation, resources, and reverence that most members of the Order can only dream of. But the deep tragedy of the Adeptus Mechanicus The thing that you notice when you look at them with real attention is not what they are searching for. It is what they have lost the ability to do in the meantime. Because the Adeptus Mechanicus has, over the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, largely lost the ability to innovate.
You know, I want to pause here for a second because this is actually the part of the story that got me when I first went down this rabbit hole. Like, I've covered a lot of 40k lore on this channel, and most of it is just cool. It's cool, it's grimdark, it's fun to talk about. But this genuinely made me stop and think, because here you have this creature that the Imperium have spent centuries writing off as a savage, a beast, a thing to be exterminated, and then you actually look at what it built, and the engineers of humanity don't have an answer for it. That is a strange feeling. It's uncomfortable in the best way. It puts something in front of you that the setting itself doesn't want you to look at too closely. And I love that about it. But anyways, that is just my take. Let's go back to the video.
Not completely. There are exceptions. Brilliant individuals like Gazghkull, who is something of a rebel and a genius in equal measure, who has been doing things the Orthodox Mechanicus considers barely this side of heresy for 10,000 years. But as an organization, as a culture, as an institution, innovation is not what the Adeptus Mechanicus does. It is not what it trains for, not what it rewards, not what its belief system accommodates. The cult Mechanicus holds, as a core theological position, that all knowledge already exists. It was created by the Omnissiah at the beginning of time, encoded into the fabric of reality. The job of the tech priest is not to create new knowledge, but to find the knowledge that already exists and restore it to use. Innovation, the creation of genuinely new things, is viewed with deep suspicion. At best, it is an inferior substitute for true recovered knowledge. At worst, it is hubris, the arrogance of the flesh mind imagining itself capable of adding to the work of the divine. This has a practical consequence of enormous significance, where a genuine understanding of how something works would allow a tech priest to repair or improve it. The Mechanicus has increasingly substituted ritual for understanding. The procedure for starting an engine is not executed because the tech priest understands the thermodynamic principles involved. It is executed because the prescribed ritual says to apply sanctified oils and recite particular passages of the canticles of the Omnissiah before turning the ignition. And this is the procedure that has worked for 10,000 years, and deviation from it is suspicious if not actively dangerous. This is not stupidity. The tech priests are not foolish. They are, individually, often extraordinarily intelligent, but they are operating within a system that has, over millennia, traded understanding for procedure, and procedure, however well maintained, has limits. It cannot handle novelty. It cannot respond to an enemy who does something you have not seen before, and therefore have no prescribed ritual to counter. A tech priest who encounters a piece of technology they do not recognize is in genuine difficulty. They cannot simply examine it and work out how it functions through first principles, because the training they have received does not develop first principles thinking. It develops pattern matching, comparing the unknown thing to known templates, looking for similarities, trying to apply established procedures by analogy. When the analogy fails, when the unknown thing is genuinely unlike anything in the database, the tech priest is operating without a map, and orc technology, by and large, is genuinely unlike anything in the database. Section 5. The mirror nobody wanted to look into. This is where the philosophical weight of Orimedes starts to make itself felt. Because what you are looking at, when you examine the mechboy and the tech priest side by side, is not simply two different approaches to the same problem. You are looking at something far more unsettling than that. You are looking at what the Adeptus Mechanicus is trying to become, already existing in green form and dripping with machine oil. Let me be precise about this. The tech priest is engaged in a lifelong project of transformation, replacing the fallible organic with the perfect mechanical, augmenting the biological brain with data stacks and logic engines, trying to become more perfectly capable of understanding and manipulating technology. The goal, in theological terms, is a kind of union with the omnissiah, the fullest possible comprehension of the machine god's creation. What does that union look like in practice? It looks like a being who understands technology intuitively, instinctively, who can interact with it directly without the mediation of ritual and procedure, who carries within themselves the knowledge of how machines work at a deep and fundamental level. That description maps onto a mechboy with uncomfortable precision. The mechboy does not need rituals to awaken a machine's spirit. He doesn't need them because he is operating from something deeper than procedural knowledge. He knows the machine the way you know your own body, not the way a doctor knows a patient's body, through learned anatomy and diagnostic procedure, but the way you know whether your leg hurts, whether your hand is getting tired. Direct, immediate, pre-articulate knowledge. The tech priest is trying to achieve this state through a combination of augmentation, study, and devotional practice. The mechboy is born with it, or more precisely, was engineered to have it 60 million years ago by entities whose technological sophistication the Adeptus Mechanicus can barely imagine, let alone equal. There is more. The tech priest's goal, the recovery of the STC, the re-establishment of a complete technological knowledge base, is driven by the recognition that the Imperium has lost knowledge that it once had. The Dark Age of technology was a period of capability that has never been recaptured. The STC represented encoded, inheritable technical knowledge, the ability to build anything from a database without requiring the builders to understand the principles involved. A kind of genetic encoding of technology, if you want to be provocative about it. And what is the orc technogene but exactly that? Knowledge encoded in the genome, inheritable, self-replicating, impossible to fully erase or corrupt. Not a database on a hard drive that can be destroyed. Not a tradition that can be disrupted by war or cultural collapse. Written into the orc's very biology, 60 million years ago, by beings who understood something about the preservation of knowledge that the Adeptus Mechanicus is still working toward. The quest for knowledge is, at its deepest level, a search for a recovery mechanism, a way to restore the lost encyclopedia of human technological achievement. And the orcs are already sitting on the closest thing the galaxy has to a perfect solution to that problem. A species where the core knowledge needed to maintain an advanced technology is literally hereditary. The tech priest's greatest aspiration, made flesh and currently smashing things apart with a wrench in the back of a space hulk somewhere. It gets worse. The Adeptus Mechanicus's theology holds that the omnissiah works through chosen individuals, that the ability to comprehend the machine god's creation is a kind of grace, a gift from the divine. The greatest tech priests are not simply skilled, they are, in the Mechanicus understanding, closer to the omnissiah. Their knowledge is a form of holiness, their workshops are temples, their augmentations are acts of devotion. The orc mechboy builds in service to Gork and Mork. He does not think of it this way, because orcs are not notably given to theological introspection, but the structure is identical. The orc gods work through their champions, and the mechboys are among those champions, particularly when, as happens during large gatherings, the ambient psychic field generated by the assembled hordes begins to focus through the mechboys, amplifying their work, as if the gods themselves are feeding power through their chosen instruments. Gargants, the immense walking war machines that are the orcs' equivalent of imperial titans, are explicitly understood by the orcs to be avatars of Gork and Mork, living idols, and the mechboys who build them do so guided by visions of the gods, images of what the finished machine should look like that arrive fully formed in the builder's mind during states of heightened creativity. Inspiration, in the most literal sense, breathed in from a divine source. The imperial titan princeps, who fights at the controls of a god engine in the name of the emperor, is, structurally, doing the same thing as the mechboy who builds the gargant in a vision granted by Gork. Both are servants of divine technology. Both understand their work as holy. Both inhabit the boundary between the mortal and the mechanical in service of something greater than themselves. The difference is that one of them built their god engine by following prescribed templates handed down through unbroken tradition, and one of them built it because the knowledge surfaced from 60 million years of encoded inheritance, and neither of them would be comfortable knowing how much they have in common with the other. But Orimedes, let us be honest about this. Orimedes is not just a generic mechboy who happens to illustrate these structural parallels. Orimedes is a specific individual, and his specific story is one of the most extraordinary things in the game's lore, because he is not merely working from inherited instinct. The evidence of what he has built suggests something considerably more than that. To understand what that evidence is, we need to understand the context it emerged from. We need to follow the career of his war boss. We need to talk about Gazghkull. Section 6. Gazghkull, the prophet who needed a genius. Gazghkull, Mag Uruk Thraka, began, improbably enough, as nobody. He was a common orc of the Goth clan, the clan most associated with pure, focused, almost disciplined violence, as much as any orc can be called disciplined, living on a backwater world called Urk. He fought with the rank and file. He was probably large, because orcs grow throughout their lives, and size reflects status, so a rising orc tends to get bigger as he accumulates wins. But by all accounts, he was not yet exceptional, just another green body in a green tide, pushing forward because that is what orcs do. And then a Space Marine's bolter round hit him in the head. The round destroyed roughly 30% of his skull and a significant portion of the underlying brain tissue. By any reasonable expectation, that should have been the end of the story. Orcs are extraordinarily tough. Their biology built for survival in ways that human physiology cannot approach, but 30% of your skull being replaced by the blast of a high-powered round is not something most organisms recover from. Gazghkull recovered. Not because the wound was minor, because he found himself in the care of Mad Doc Grotznik, one of the most infamous orc surgeons in the known galaxy, a pain boy whose enthusiasm for experimental procedures vastly outpaces his concern for patient welfare, but whose technical results are, and this speaks to the mechboy parallel in an interesting way, often genuinely extraordinary. Grotznik replaced the missing sections of skull with adamantium plates, rewired the surviving brain tissue around new bionics, and held the whole thing together with what the texts describe as a combination of rivets, squig sinew, and terrifying confidence. Gazghkull woke up. And when he woke up, he could see clearly for the first time in his life. Not physically clearly, although the bionic eye Grotznik installed worked well enough, clearly in a different sense. The damage to his brain, or perhaps the specific way Grotznik had rebuilt around that damage, had unlocked something. Latent psychic capability, the scholars believe, though the exact mechanism is debated. What is beyond debate is what Gazghkull experienced. Visions. Visions of the orc gods, Gork and Mork. Visions of a unified orc race sweeping the galaxy. Visions of a crusade so vast it would make the stars themselves shake with the combined stamping of billions of green feet. He became, in his own understanding, and in the understanding of the orcs who would follow him, the prophet of the gods, their chosen instrument, their voice in the material world. Now, prophets in Warhammer 40,000 come in many varieties, and not all of them are reliable narrators of their own spiritual state. But in Gazghkull's case, whether the visions were literally divine, or whether they were the expression of extraordinary intelligence finally unlocked by unusual neurological circumstances, they produced results. Stunning, consistent, strategically sophisticated results that are almost without precedent in the history of an orc warlord. He was cunning. Orcs can be cunning. It is, after all, one of Gork and Mork's core divine attributes. But they are not usually patient. They are not usually capable of playing a long game. Gazghkull was both. From the moment of his recovery, he was thinking years ahead. He was thinking about the scale of what he wanted to achieve, and working backwards to what he needed to do to get there. He rose from the rank and file to war boss with brutal efficiency. Within 6 years of his recovery, he led his clan. A year after that, a dying star and a prophetic vision converged to give him the justification he needed to do something no ordinary orc warboss would ever consider: launch a coordinated, multi-tribal invasion of one of the most heavily defended and strategically significant Imperial worlds in the Segmentum Solar. The Second War for Armageddon in 941 M41 was not a victory for Gazghkull. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, one of the most famous Imperial Guard officers in the 41st Millennium, held the line with a stubbornness that the Orc warlord found genuinely impressive, eventually turning the tide and forcing the greenskin horde back. But here is the thing: Gazghkull did not treat it as a defeat. He treated it as data. He said, in words that have been preserved and translated by Imperial scholars because of what they reveal about how unlike a typical Orc he thinks, to destroy your enemy, you must first know them. Armageddon was not an attempt to conquer. It was a test of Imperial defenses, a reconnaissance in force on the grandest scale imaginable, executed at a cost of millions of lives purely so that Gazghkull could understand exactly what he would be facing next time. This kind of strategic thinking is, in the most literal sense, alien to conventional Orc warfare. Orcs do not lose battles and take notes. They lose battles and then fight again, maybe slightly harder. The concept of deliberately accepting a defeat in the present in order to win more decisively in the future requires a capacity for delayed gratification and long-term planning that the Orc psyche does not typically accommodate. Gazghkull did not care. He already knew what the future held because the gods had shown it to him. He spent the next 57 years, the same period of time that separates most human generations, systematically preparing for the Third War. He tested Imperial responses at other locations. He cultivated alliances with other Orc warbosses, trading military assistance for technical secrets. He acquired the initial teleporter schematics from warboss Nazdreg, who was known for having exceptional mechboys in his employ, in exchange for helping Nazdreg during the Battle of Pesina IV. He built an Orc empire of industrial capacity, converting conquered worlds into factories, accumulating the material and the numbers and the technical capability he would need. What Gazghkull was doing during those 57 years is worth examining in some detail because it illuminates the context in which Orimedes was working. It tells us something about the specific brief that the world's greatest Orc engineer was given, and the resources he had to work with. After Piscina, Gazghkull moved to the Golgotha system, which he intended to convert into an industrial base for his planned third invasion. This is where Yarrick caught up with him, the old adversary, the one-eyed commissar who had somehow survived the Second War and devoted his subsequent life to hunting Gazghkull down. The ensuing Battle of Golgotha was another tactical win for the Orcs, but more remarkable for what happened after. Gazghkull captured Yarrick, had him brought in, spent time with him, and then, in a gesture that is either the strangest form of respect in the entire Warhammer universe or a tactical calculation of extraordinary cynicism, let him go. His stated reason, preserved in Imperial records that captured the story second and third hand, was that Yarrick was too good an opponent to waste. The Third War would be more interesting with Yarrick in it. The future prophet of Gork and Mork did not just want to win. He wanted to win interestingly. He wanted to test himself against the best the Imperium could offer, because that was what the gods wanted. That was what the visions showed. Not a quick, crushing, unresisted victory. What would the gods want with that? But the greatest clash of arms that the galaxy had seen in generations, the kind of war that would shake loose something new from the universe, that would prove the Orc race worthy of the destiny Gazghkull could see waiting at the end of the path. He needed to be patient. He needed to be thorough. He needed to build something that could not only defeat the Imperium's defenses but overwhelm them so completely that there was no recovery, no regrouping, no rallying. He needed the teleporter. And this is where Orimedes' role becomes central to understanding the whole arc of the Third War. Because the teleporter was not just a weapon, it was the cornerstone of an entire strategic vision. The Orc invasion could not succeed at the scale Gazghkull envisioned it through conventional means. The Imperium of Man had defended Armageddon before. They had had 57 years to improve those defenses, to expand the naval presence, to harden the hive cities. A straightforward invasion, drop pods, landing craft, ground assault, would face a prepared defense of extraordinary depth. But a teleportation system of sufficient range and reliability changes everything about that equation. It means that the defending force can never know where the next wave of attackers is coming from. It means that heavy reinforcements can arrive at any point on the battlefield almost instantaneously, bypassing the conventional interdiction of orbital defenses and anti-air installations. It means that the rocks, which the Imperials might destroy a significant percentage of, are only the beginning of the threat, not the end, because each surviving rock becomes an anchor point from which the real assault can be launched. Gazghkull could see all of this. The visions had shown him the shape of the victory, even if not the specific details, and he had, in Orimedes, someone who could build the specific technical implementation that would make the vision real. The question that naturally arises is, how long had Orimedes been working on the teleporter problem? And the answer, if the timeline of events is any guide, is a very long time. Nasdrig's mechboys provided the initial secrets, the baseline from which Orimedes began. But the teleporter arrays deployed at Armageddon were not Nasdrig's technology. They were something new, extended in range, deployed at a scale that had never been attempted, integrated into a strategic plan of extraordinary sophistication. That did not happen in a few years. That was the product of decades of work. Somewhere, during all those years of Gazghkull's preparation, Orimedes was in a workshop, surrounded by the wreckage of things that had not worked, and the working prototypes of things that had, testing, refining, unlocking deeper layers of the genetic inheritance, pushing the physics of teleportation further than anyone, orc or human, had pushed it before. And throughout all of this, this is a very specific kind of genius. It is not the genius of starting from scratch and building something new. It is the genius of understanding an existing system well enough to see where it falls short and exactly what needs to change. It is the kind of improvement that only someone with a deep, intuitive grasp of how the machines actually work, not how they are described, not what their ritual maintenance procedure says, but how they actually physically function, could accomplish. The princeps recognized this. The gallows humor of frontline warriors being what it is, they named their nemesis after one of the ancient world's greatest engineering minds. And thus, an orc, who may or may not exist, acquired one of the most resonant names in the game's lore. But there is more to this than weapons range. The Gargant improvements were the first sign. What Orimedes had clearly been working on throughout the 57-year build-up was something far more ambitious. He had been working on the teleporter. Teleportation technology is not unique to the orcs. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the Adeptus Astartes both have access to teleportation equipment. Chaos warbands use warp-assisted teleportation methods of various terrifying varieties. The ancient Necrons move through what they call their dimensional fold technology. But all of these systems share a fundamental limitation: range. The practical limit of most teleportation technology, and this is the consensus across most of the major factions of the 40k galaxy, is a relatively short distance. Enough to go from a ship in low orbit to the planet's surface. Enough to conduct ship-to-ship boarding actions. Significant by human scale, but cosmically speaking, negligible. The reason is not primarily technological. It is the nature of reality. Moving mass through space, through whatever mechanism, whether it involves the warp or some form of conventional physics, becomes exponentially more difficult as the distance involved increases. Maintaining cohesion of the teleported object, or person, or mob of orcs, across greater distances means maintaining control of an increasingly complex warp transit, while the ambient currents of the Imperium work against you. The mathematics, to the extent that there is mathematics in teleportation technology of the 41st millennium, becomes increasingly unworkable at greater distances. Orimedes solved this problem, not elegantly, and not in a way that would pass muster with a tech priest trained in the conventional doctrines of the Mechanicus. The solutions involved, reportedly, a great deal of redundancy. If you send enough mobs, enough will arrive, and an approach to precision that is orc rather than imperial in character, meaning some degree of variance is built into the acceptable parameters. But he solved it in the functional sense. He built teleporters that worked at ranges measured not in the tens of megameters that are the normal limit, but in astronomical units. Distances you would measure in terms of the solar system as a whole, distances that are, by the standards of teleportation technology in the 41st millennium, essentially impossible. He built them, deployed them in the rocks, falling on Armageddon, and they worked. Section 8, the teleporte, engineering the impossible. To understand how extraordinary this achievement is, you need to appreciate what a rock actually is and what it was designed to do during the Third War for Armageddon. An orc rock is not a ship in the conventional sense. It is an asteroid that has been hollowed out, filled with orcs, weapons, and, in this case, enormous teleporter arrays, and then hurled at a planet from orbit. The basic concept is brutally elegant. Asteroids are not unusual in any system. They don't register on most threat assessment systems as warships. And they are, once in motion, extremely difficult to stop. You can shoot at a rock, and if your firepower is sufficient, you can damage or destroy it. But they are essentially giant rocks moving under momentum, and intercepting them all is a significant challenge. The conventional understanding of the rock assault is that it delivers the orcs inside to the planet's surface, along with whatever weapons the rock carries. The rock lands, the doors open, and the orcs charge out. This is devastating, but simple. What Orimedes changed was that the rocks were also carrying something else. Inside each of those hollowed-out asteroids, alongside the thousands of orcs ready to charge, there were massive teleporter arrays. Receiving stations, essentially, that would remain active after landing and allow further material to be transported down directly from the orbiting fleet. Not people, or at least not primarily people. Equipment, war machines, gargants. The vast and heavy materiel of an orc invasion, bypassing the landers and the drop pods and all the conventional methods of surface delivery that the Imperial defenses were prepared to handle. The scale of this is hard to overstate. The Third War for Armageddon drew in over 25 Space Marine chapters, dozens of Astra Militarum regiments, and several Titan legions, and it was described as an extremely narrow Imperial victory. The orcs were on the cusp of conquering one of the most militarily significant planets in the segmentum solar. A significant part of why they got that close, why the invasion succeeded in reaching the scale it did, was the teleporter system. Without it, the invasion would have been far more manageable. With it, the orcs could deliver reinforcements and heavy equipment faster than the Imperials could address each new front. And the range deserves special attention. Orimedes built teleporters capable of operating with precision, and here the records acknowledge the term is relative, at ranges measured across the breadth of a star system. The analyses done by Imperial scholars and recovered from intelligence reports put the functional range significantly beyond anything in the existing database of comparable technology. One scholarly assessment noted that the effective range was enough to drop mobs of orcs from the edges of the Armageddon system itself, a distance so far beyond conventional teleportation limits that the same report almost reads as if the author cannot quite believe what they are recording. The psychic field undoubtedly helped. The massed armies gathering on Armageddon, the collective excitement and aggression of one of the largest orc invasions in millennia, would have generated a significant ambient field boost to every bit of orc technology in the region. But the field alone does not explain the range. The fundamental engineering has to be sound for the boost to matter. A broken machine does not work better because a lot of orcs are excited nearby. The bone structure of the engineering has to be right. It was right, and while we cannot say with certainty that Archimedes understood the physics of warp transit and teleportation theory in the way that a magos explorator of the Adeptus Mechanicus would articulate it. We can say that he had a working model of how the technology functioned that was accurate enough to allow him to extend its range by an order of magnitude. Whether that working model was conscious or instinctive, analytical or intuitive, the result was the same, a system that worked where no comparable system in the Imperial arsenal could have worked. The Mechanicus scholars who quietly examined the remains of the teleporter arrays after the war, and there were such scholars, as we will discuss, found themselves in a difficult position. On the one hand, the arrays were built in the usual chaotic orc fashion, with components that seemed arbitrary, connections that violated conventional engineering logic, and a general approach to structural integrity that would have made a fabricator general need to sit down. On the other hand, they worked, and the principle underlying the extended range was, on close examination, not entirely incorrect. It was crude, it was brute-forced in a way that a tech priest would find aesthetically offensive, but it represented a genuine engineering insight that the Mechanicus had not previously possessed. The insight was new, not recovered, not derived from an STC template or a recovered archive. New, as in, conceived by a mind that worked it out from the ground up, from first principles of how teleportation technology functions, and arrived at a solution that no one else had arrived at before. In the theology of the Adeptus Mechanicus, this is close to impossible. All knowledge exists already. Innovation is not the discovery of new knowledge, but the recovery of lost knowledge, rearranged. And yet here, in the wreckage of an orc rock on a devastated hive world, was evidence of genuine innovation, evidence that a mechboy had thought his way to something new. It was quietly disturbing to the scholars who noticed it, which is possibly why the official records of the Mechanicus' assessment of the teleporter arrays are, shall we say, more circumspect about the engineering than you might expect. Section 9. Under the Waves. The submarines of Armageddon. There is a second major achievement that is attributed to Archimedes during the Third War, one that is less discussed than the teleporter, but in its own way just as revealing about the nature of the mind behind it. The submarines. When the Orc fleet arrived in the Armageddon system in 998 Siege 41 and began the invasion, the Imperial strategists did what all competent military planners do. They assessed the operational environment and identified the elements that were either impossible or irrelevant. Armageddon is a hive world. Its population is concentrated in its vast hive cities, massive urban complexes of towering spires and industrial low-levels that stretch across the main continental landmasses. The planet has large bodies of water, including the Tempest Ocean and the Boiling Sea. But Imperial strategic doctrine had long since concluded that these water bodies were not strategically significant. Naval capability in the sense of surface ships or submarines was not a major factor in 41st Millennium warfare on a standard hive world, where air power and ground forces dominated. The Fire Wastes, a region in the planet's northern reaches, were specifically judged to be of no tactical importance. Remote, inhospitable, essentially uninhabited, not worth monitoring closely, not worth garrisoning. The Fire Wastes were where Archimedes built his shipyard. The records indicate that hundreds of orc submersibles were constructed there, cannibalized and cobbled together from the hulks of disused Imperial tankers. The orcs had landed in the Fire Wastes as part of the initial invasion, in what seemed to the Imperial commanders to be a puzzling choice. Why waste resources on a strategically worthless region? Now the answer was clear. They were not there to hold the territory. They were there to build. The submersibles were enormous. They were, by all accounts, roughly the size of the tankers from which they had been built, which is to say large enough to carry substantial numbers of orc infantry, and crucially, the weapons and equipment to support an assault on a fortified hive city. They were equipped with torpedoes, artillery pieces of a pattern the records describe as sea cannons, and the sort of heavy support firepower that orc mechboys routinely produce. And they travelled undetected across the ocean floor between the Fire Wastes and Armageddon Prime. They surfaced around Hive Tempestora, With essentially no warning, the surprise was total, and Hive Tempestora, a major fortified city that had been resisting the conventional orc assault from above for weeks, fell within days. The underwater approach had bypassed every defensive layer, every gun emplacement, every reinforcement corridor. It had arrived from a direction that the Imperial forces had not thought to defend, because they had not thought it possible. Hell's Reach came next. The submersibles struck the dockyards before the defenders fully understood what was happening. And while the Black Templars under Reclusiarch Grimaldus managed to prevent a complete fall of the Hive, in what became one of the most celebrated defensive actions of the era, the damage was devastating. The dockyards fell. The Orcs had control of a significant portion of one of Armageddon's most important port facilities. Think about what this required. Building submarines is a not trivial engineering challenge. They need to maintain watertight integrity under pressure. They need a propulsion system capable of sustained underwater travel. They need navigation capability. They need the mechanical systems to operate the weapons while submerged. All of this is achievable. The Imperium has submarines, and this is not contested technology at the fundamental level. But it requires solving a specific set of problems that are different from the problems of surface naval design, or ground vehicle design, or spacecraft design. And it was done in secret, in a region so remote that the Imperials were not watching it. Under the constraints of limited time and limited resources, using components salvaged from decommissioned ships. It was done quickly enough that the submersibles were operational at the right moment in the battle sequence, which means the construction schedule was planned and executed with a precision that you would not naturally associate with orc engineering projects. Someone planned this. Someone understood that the submarines needed to be ready at a specific time, that the operational timeline of the invasion required their commitment at a particular phase of the campaign. Someone thought through the problem of how to attack hive cities that were well defended from every conventional approach, and identified the ocean floor as the correct solution. The evidence points to Orimedes, and everything about how the submarines were deployed speaks to the same methodical intelligence that produced the teleporter. The Gargant improvements were tactical upgrades, better weapons range, better combat effectiveness, important, but working within an existing framework. The teleporters were strategic innovations, changing the fundamental logistics of an invasion in a way that the Imperials had no prepared response to. The submarines were operational art, the integration of a completely novel capability into the campaign at exactly the right moment to achieve a specific effect that could not have been achieved any other way. This is not one kind of genius. This is 3 different kinds of military technological intelligence operating simultaneously, all flowing from the same source. Orimedes was not just a good engineer. He was a military engineer in the fullest sense of the term. Someone who understood what was needed, when it was needed, and what he had to build to produce it. And yet he remains a ghost. After the Third War, after the Space Hulk that was believed to be his base of operations was forced to flee the Armageddon system by the Imperial Navy, the trail goes cold. He is with Gazghkull, presumably, still building, still tinkering, still unlocking deeper layers of the inheritance the Brain Boys left 60 million years ago. The kill orders are still on the Officio Assassinorum's books. They have been there for decades. They will probably be there for decades more. Section 10. What the Adeptus Mechanicus quietly admits. There is an episode from slightly earlier in Imperial history that casts the entire Adeptus Mechanicus relationship with orc technology in a particularly revealing light. It involves the single most powerful position in the Mechanicus hierarchy, the Fabricator General of Mars himself. And it is an episode that the Mechanicus would very much prefer was not discussed. The War of the Beast, in 544 NC 32, was the single most devastating orc invasion in all of recorded Imperial history. The orc warlord known only as the Beast, his real name, if he had one, is lost, commanded a force that dwarfed even Gazghkull's Third War. He struck at the heart of the Imperium. His attack moons, planetoid-sized weapons platforms constructed with Orc technology of a sophistication that genuinely alarmed Imperial scholars, threatened Terra itself. The Mechanicus Fabricator General at the time was Kubik, and Kubik's actions during the War of the Beast and its aftermath tell you everything you need to know about the Adeptus Mechanicus's real relationship with Orc technology. Officially, the Mechanicus views Orc technology as inferior, crude, dangerous, and probably tainted by proximity to heretical energies. Officially, it is to be destroyed or studied only under tightly controlled conditions, and any findings are to be locked in restricted archives, rather than integrated into the Mechanicus knowledge base. Kubik knew better, or at least, he acted on a different assessment in private. He secretly arranged for the attack moon above Terra to be captured rather than destroyed, against the wishes of the Imperial military commanders, who wanted it eliminated as rapidly as possible. He had his researchers study the gravitic whip technology, a weapon system of extraordinary power and novelty, and other Orc innovations aboard the attack moon with an attention and intensity that could only be described as covetous. He reverse-engineered the Orc teleportation technology from the attack moon and built working prototype devices from it. He then used that reverse-engineered technology to secretly teleport the entire Orc capital of Gorkogrod from the planet Ulanor to a location of his choosing, rather than complying with orders to enact exterminatus on the site. He wanted the capital. He wanted everything in it. He was not done studying. When this was discovered, it contributed directly to one of the most dramatic and bloody events in Imperial political history, the beheading, in which the Grand Master of Assassins, Drakon Vangorich, already at the end of his patience with the High Lord's dysfunction and self-interest, used the Kubik revelation as the final justification for assassinating the entire High Lords of Terra. Kubik himself was cornered by Vangorich personally and given an ultimatum: death or voluntary shutdown. He chose shutdown. The story of Kubik is important for several reasons. The first is that it demonstrates that the most senior and knowledgeable individual in the Adeptus Mechanicus, the person with the highest level of technical expertise and the fullest access to the Mechanicus knowledge base, did not respond to advanced Orc technology with dismissal. He responded with the academic equivalent of grabbing it with both hands and refusing to let go. He coveted it. He risked his political position and ultimately his existence for it. And he managed to successfully reverse engineer a significant portion of it, which means the underlying principles were accessible to a sufficiently skilled tech priest once they were willing to engage with them directly, rather than dismissing them as inferior Xenos work. There is something almost poetic about the specific technology that Kubik chose to prioritize. Out of all the extraordinary weapons and systems aboard the attack moon, gravitic whips, force field generators, the planet-scale engineering of the attack moon itself, he chose to focus most intently on the teleportation technology, the matter displacement systems, the ability to move mass through space across distances and to specific locations, because that is the technology that has the most transformative strategic implications. That is the technology that changes the calculus of every engagement, every campaign, every invasion. If you can move your forces where your enemy is not and cannot be reached in time, you control the battlefield regardless of the opponent's strength. The Imperium's enormous defensive infrastructure is built on the assumption that it knows where the next attack will come from. A sufficiently long-range, sufficiently accurate teleportation system breaks that assumption entirely. Kubik understood this. He may have been the first person in the Adeptus Mechanicus to fully understand it, or he may have been the first to act on it rather than setting the data aside in a restricted archive. But he understood it clearly enough to risk everything: his position, the intact state of Ulanor, his relationship with the other High Lords, to study it. And then, a few hundred years later, an Orc engineer who technically does not exist solved the same problem at greater ranges, using an approach that was crude in form but correct in principle. The second reason the Kubik story matters is what it reveals about the systematic dishonesty of the Mechanicus's official position on Orc technology. The party line holds that Orc tech is primitive, unreliable, and of limited interest. Kubik's private actions reveal that at least some senior members of the Order know very well that this is not fully true. That there are things in the Orc technical tradition, things discovered or retained by the Old One's engineering of the Orc genome, that the Mechanicus does not possess and cannot derive from any existing template or archive. Things that they want, quietly, desperately, in the spaces where the theology does not need to be consulted. There is a particular irony in the Kubik episode that connects directly back to Orimedes. The Orc technology that the Fabricator General of Mars found most compelling, the system he reverse-engineered, the system he built working prototypes from, was the teleportation technology, not the gravitic whips, not the attack moon itself, not any of the war machinery, the teleportation, the same class of technology that Orimedes had been working on for 57 years on behalf of Gazghkull, the same challenge that Orimedes would demonstrably solve at greater ranges than anything Kubik produced. If Kubik, the Fabricator General, the most powerful and knowledgeable tech priest alive at the time, with the entire resources of the Adeptus Mechanicus available to him, found Orc teleportation technology worth concealing a planet for, worth the political catastrophe that followed its discovery, worth his own destruction when Vangorich cornered him, then what would that same Fabricator General have given for the chance to study Orimedes' teleporter arrays up close? The answer, I suspect, would have been considerably more than he paid for Ulanor. This is the hidden current beneath the official Mechanicus position on Orc technology. They say primitive, they say heretical, they say unworthy of serious study, but behind the theology, behind the prescribed contempt, there is something that looks uncomfortably like recognition, like being shown a solution to a problem you have been failing to solve for 10,000 years, presented by a being you have been taught to view as subhuman. And the Officio Assassinorum kill orders tell their own story. You do not put an individual on the most serious kill list in the Imperium because they are merely militarily dangerous. Dangerous individuals get put down when possible and avoided when not. You put someone on a kill order of this level and maintain it across decades, long after the specific war where they demonstrated their capabilities, because they represent something that threatens you in a way that goes beyond military threat. He is, in the deepest and most uncomfortable sense, a challenge to the faith. There is one more dimension to this that I want to explore before we move on, because I think it is essential to fully appreciating the story. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not only seek knowledge for abstract theological reasons. There is a very practical dimension to the quest for knowledge that is directly connected to the Imperium's survival. The Imperium of man is, at the technical level, in decline. It has been in decline since the Horus heresy. Not fast decline. The Mechanicus's extraordinary ability to maintain and replicate existing technology means that the standard equipment of the Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Astartes has remained largely consistent across 10,000 years. But the frontier is shrinking. New capabilities are not being developed at the rate that old capabilities are being lost. The wars keep consuming materiel and knowledge that cannot be fully replaced. A functional STC database would, in principle, reverse this. It would restore access to the technology of the Dark Age of technology, which was beyond anything the current Imperium can produce. It would re-establish the knowledge base that has been eroding for 10,000 years. Orc mechboy technology is in a different position. It is not in decline. The techno gene does not decay. Every new generation of mechboys has access to the same genetic inheritance as the last, and the accumulated experience of mechboys across millions of years of building and fighting and rebuilding has, in some cases, taken that inheritance and extended it into genuinely new territory. Orimedes is the clearest example of this. He took the teleporter schematics that Gazghkull acquired from Nasdreg, already more advanced than the baseline Orc teleportation technology, and extended them, not just scaled them up, genuinely extended the underlying principle in a direction that the existing technology did not previously go, increased the range not by brute force, but by understanding something deeper about how the technology functioned. That is not merely maintenance, that is not replication. That is, by the Mechanicus' own standards, the very thing they are searching for, knowledge that was not previously held, arrived at by a mind capable of genuine comprehension. The bitter irony is that the Mechanicus cannot learn from him without either acknowledging what he is or doing what Kubik did in private, studying the wreckage quietly, in restricted archives, not in the official records, because admitting that an Orc engineer has produced something worth learning from is a theological statement the cult Mechanicus is not prepared to make in public. And so the kill orders remain. Not because eliminating Orimedes would be easy, it has proven to be essentially impossible, as the Officio Assassinorum's decades of failure amply demonstrate, but because having the orders in place allows the Mechanicus to maintain the position that Orimedes is a military threat to be neutralized, rather than what he actually is, a technical mind producing genuine innovations that the Mechanicus would very much like to study and cannot publicly admit they want. The orders are, in this reading, a theological defense mechanism, a way of asserting that the correct response to Orc technical capability is elimination rather than engagement, even when the evidence of what he builds makes engagement the far more intellectually honest choice. Orimedes, in one reading, threatens the Adeptus Mechanicus's monopoly on technological capability. His existence, or rather, the existence of whatever he has built and will build, suggests that the Mechanicus is not the only authority on how technology works. It suggests that there is another way of knowing machines, another form of competence, another tradition, 60 million years old and encoded in DNA, that produces results that the Mechanicus's 10,000-year-old ritual-based approach cannot reliably match. That is a threat to a great deal more than the walls of Armageddon. Section 11, Krork, Mork, and the Omnissiah. To fully appreciate what we are looking at here, we need to go one level deeper, beyond the practical parallels between mechboys and tech priests, beyond the specific case of Orimedes and the Adeptus Mechanicus. We need to look at the theological level, because the most extraordinary thing about this entire situation is not that the Orcs have instinctive technical knowledge, and the Imperium has procedural technical knowledge. It is not even that those two forms of knowledge at their best produce comparable results despite operating on completely different principles. The most extraordinary thing is that both of these traditions are, in their own way, expressions of the same underlying truth about the 40k universe. The warp is real. The gods that inhabit it are real. Real in the specific sense that the 40k universe means when it says something is real, which involves a particular relationship between belief, consciousness, and the fabric of reality that does not have a clean equivalent in most other fictional universes. What people believe in sufficient numbers and with sufficient intensity takes on material consequences. It shapes the warp. It feeds the entities that dwell there. In some cases, it creates those entities. The chaos gods are, at some level, the collective emanation of human emotion and human failing, made vast and terrible by the psychic output of trillions of minds across millennia. But the chaos gods are not the only things in the warp. Krork and Mork are also real. At least the lore strongly implies this. There are accounts from figures with direct psychic experience of the warp who speak of the Orc gods as genuine, powerful entities. Gazghkull's visions are presented as authentically prophetic, not as delusion. The Orc gestalt field, which all Orcs generate, and which grows more powerful as their numbers increase, feeds something ancient and enormous and, in its way, genuinely divine. Krork is cunningly brutal. Mork is brutally cunning. The distinction between them is subtle enough that Orcs regularly argue, sometimes at great length and with great physical emphasis, about which is which. But both together encompass the totality of the Orc way, the combination of violence and intelligence that makes a great Orc warboss, or a great Orc mechboy, or the greatest of all warbosses who is also, in his own way, the living proof that the two qualities together are greater than either alone. The mechboy builds in service to Krork and Mork, even if he does not think of it in those terms. When a big mech receives a vision of what a gargant should look like and begins building toward it, he is enacting the will of the gods. When Orimedes sits in his workshop and the solutions to impossible engineering problems surface in his mind with a clarity that cannot entirely be explained by education or training, there is something feeding that clarity from outside. The psychic field of assembled orcs connects individual orcs to something larger than themselves. It is the medium through which the gods work. The Omnissiah works the same way in the Adeptus Mechanicus theology. The greatest tech priests are not merely skilled individuals. They are instruments of the machine god. Their comprehension is a form of grace, a divine gift flowing through the chosen vessel. The Omnissiah's knowledge is infinite. The tech priest's task is to open themselves to receive as much of it as they can, stripping away the distractions of flesh and the noise of individual experience in favor of a progressively purer communion with the machine god's data. Two traditions, two gods of knowledge and making, two communities of people or organisms who dedicate their lives to the service of their respective divine patron through the medium of technology. The structural parallels are not accidental, they are emergent. They arise from the basic truth that in the 40k universe, sufficiently strong and sufficiently focused belief shapes reality. If a species has been building things and worshipping the principle of building for long enough, with enough passion and enough numbers, they will eventually call something into existence in the warp that corresponds to that devotion. Krork and Mork are, among other things, the accumulated devotion of an orc race that has been fighting and building since before humanity descended from the trees on old Earth. Their relationship to orc technology is not metaphorical. The gods of the orcs are, at some level, the spiritual dimension of the orc techno gene, the animating principle of orc making reflected in the warp. And the Omnissiah, whether it is truly the Emperor or the void dragon sleeping beneath Mars or something else entirely, is the spiritual dimension of humanity's relationship with its own technology, the accumulated reverence of billions of people who have lived and died by the machines their civilization depends on, shaped over millennia into something vast and powerful. Orimedes is a servant of Krork and Mork. Every teleporter he builds, every gargant he improves, every submarine he conceives and launches is an act of worship. He does not think of it this way, probably. Orcs are not given to theological reflection, but the structure is there. The mechboy's compulsion to build, the irresistible drive that makes them pick up tools and begin working even when no one has asked, even at personal risk, even in the middle of a battle, that is not simply desire. It is devotion expressed through hands and tools rather than words. A tech priest, deep in the rituals of maintenance, chanting the hymns of the cult Mechanicus as they apply the sacred oils to a titan's joints, is also performing an act of devotion. The ritual has largely replaced the understanding in most cases, it is true. But at its best, in its original intent, the ritual was meant to create a specific mental and spiritual state in the priest, a state of focus and reverence in which the work of the machine god could flow through them more cleanly. A meditation technique for engineering, a way of aligning the self with the divine principle of making. The mechboy achieves this state naturally, automatically, because the alignment is written into his genes. He does not need rituals to enter the mental space where the knowledge flows. He simply is in that space, all the time, whenever he picks up a tool. The devotion and the capability are unified in a way that the tech priest tradition has been struggling toward for 10,000 years. Let me be precise about this. The tech priest is engaged in a lifelong project of transformation, replacing the fallible organic with the perfect mechanical, augmenting the biological brain with data stacks and logic engines, trying to become more perfectly capable of understanding and manipulating technology. The goal, in theological terms, is a kind of union with the Omnissiah, the fullest possible comprehension of the machine god's creation, What does that union look like in practice? It looks like a being who understands technology intuitively, instinctively, who can interact with it directly without the mediation of ritual and procedure, who carries within themselves the knowledge of how machines work at a deep and fundamental level. That description maps onto a mechboy with uncomfortable precision. There is a further parallel that is worth drawing out carefully, because it speaks to the deepest layer of what the cult mechanicus is aspiring toward. In the later stages of augmentation, the most advanced tech priests begin to replace not just their limbs and sensory organs, but their cognitive processes. Data stacks supplement memory. Logic engines process certain categories of problem faster and more reliably than organic cognition can. Mechadendrites, the articulated mechanical appendages that are the most visible mark of a tech priest of significant rank, give the practitioner additional channels of interaction with technology, allowing them to interface directly with machines without the mediation of tools or keyboards or any other physical intermediate. The end state this is moving toward, in the theological vision of the most devout tech priests, is something like a being for whom the distinction between self and machine has dissolved, a consciousness that inhabits both organic and mechanical forms simultaneously, that perceives technology as an extension of self rather than a separate thing to be manipulated. A state of union where the knowledge of how machines work is not held in the mind as information, but is woven into the fabric of perception itself. Mechboys are born in that state, not the final, refined, fully conscious state of the theoretical mechanicus saint. Their relationship with machine knowledge is instinctive rather than fully articulate, gestural rather than verbal, encoded in the body rather than held in the mind as explicit information. But the core of it, the direct, unmediated, pre-procedural connection with how mechanical things work, is there from birth. The thing that the tech priest is spending an entire career and a body's worth of augmentation trying to achieve, the mechboy has as a birthright. This is not, I want to be clear, a claim that mechboys are smarter than tech priests. Intelligence is multidimensional, and the tech priest tradition produces genuinely brilliant individuals. Belisarius Cawl is one of the most capable minds in the 41st millennium, and there are others throughout the history of the Mechanicus whose accomplishments speak to genuine genius. The mechboy's advantage is not in general intelligence. It is specifically in the relationship with technology, and specifically in the directness of that relationship. A highly intelligent tech priest, working from first principles, can often reconstruct technical knowledge that has been lost. Cawl has done this repeatedly over 10,000 years. But the process is laborious. It requires conscious effort, deliberate investigation, systematic trial and error. The mechboy does not have to reconstruct. He just has to reach a little deeper into what was already there. The STC databases that the Mechanicus spends so much effort searching for were themselves, in their original form, a kind of encoded knowledge. Templates that could produce working results without requiring the user to understand the underlying principles. Not genetic encoding, but structural encoding. A solution to the problem of knowledge preservation that works across time by embedding the knowledge in a format that can be executed by people who do not fully understand it. The Orc techno gene is a more fundamental version of the same solution. The knowledge is not in a database that can be lost or corrupted or overwritten. It is in the biology. It reproduces with the organism. It cannot be destroyed short of destroying every orc in the galaxy. And even then, the last orc standing would be born knowing how to build a gun from scrap. The Adeptus Mechanicus is searching for the equivalent of what the orcs have already had for 60 million years. Their quest for knowledge is, at its deepest level, a search for a knowledge preservation mechanism that works as well as the one the Brain Boys built. They haven't found it yet. This is, of course, deeply threatening to the official Mechanicus theology. The cult Mechanicus's entire structure rests on the idea that knowledge is accumulated through a particular kind of devotional practice, within a particular institutional framework, under the oversight of a particular hierarchy. If a green-skinned alien engineer who has never heard of the omniscire and whose idea of theology is roughly equivalent to Gork is good, Mork is also good, they like it when you build big and shouty things, can achieve comparable or superior results through a completely different pathway, then the institutional framework is not doing what the theology claims it is doing. The knowledge is not a gift exclusive to the Mechanicus's devotional tradition. The knowledge, or at least some of it, some deep layer of it, is accessible through a completely different mechanism. And the orcs have been sitting on that mechanism for 60 million years, growing it heavier and more capable with every passing generation. This is why the kill orders are maintained, not just because Orimedes is militarily dangerous, because he is philosophically dangerous, because he exists, because his work is proof that the Mechanicus's monopoly on legitimate technological knowledge is not, in the final analysis, as complete as the theology asserts. He is, in the deepest and most uncomfortable sense, a challenge to the faith. Section 12. Legacy, mystery, and the question that remains. So where does this leave us? Orimedes is still out there. Gazghkull, following the Third War for Armageddon, left the planet and launched what has come to be called the Great Crusade of the Orcs, the most ambitious mobilization of the Green race since the War of the Beast. He arrived in the Octarius sector, the site of a brutal ongoing war between Orc hordes and the tyrannid Hive fleet Leviathan, and he did not merely join the fight, he dominated it. He conquered the resident Orc power broker, the Overfiend of Octarius, without a battle, earning the Overfiend's allegiance through the sheer force of prophetic authority. He then proceeded to fight the Tyrannids with the enthusiasm of an Orc who has found a worthy opponent after years of disappointment. And throughout all of this, the records suggest Orimedes was with him, building. The same references that place Gazghkull in the Octarius conflict mention his personal mechboy continuing to work, continuing to develop. What specifically he has been working on is not known. The officio assassinorum intelligence is fragmentary at best. What does reach Imperial knowledge suggests that the teleporter technology continues to be developed and refined. There are hints of other projects whose nature is not yet clear. Gazghkull's broader plan, as far as the Imperium has been able to determine, involves unifying the Orc race under a single command and launching the greatest coordinated invasion in galactic history. If this sounds implausible for an Orc, well, it probably was implausible before Gazghkull. It may be more plausible now, and if that vision is even partially realized, the engineering challenges involved will be extraordinary. Moving coordinated forces across stellar distances, maintaining supply lines, constructing and maintaining the kind of massive war machines that will be needed against hardened Imperial defenses, communicating across the vastness of the galaxy. All of this requires a mechboy, not just any mechboy, a mechboy of extraordinary capability, who thinks on strategic timescales, who builds things that should not work and makes them work, who understands the military application of technology as deeply as the engineering principles. It requires Orimedes. The name coined in dark humor by dying Imperial Titan Princeps has taken on a life of its own. It has become a legend, a rumor, a ghost story told in the technical seminaries of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He exists in the margins of Imperial records, the way a shadow exists at the edge of a bright light, defined by what is not there, by the space where the expected thing is absent, by the evidence of passage, rather than the direct observation of passage. What does this all mean for the lore of Warhammer 40,000? A few things I think that are worth stating plainly. The first is that the Orc race is not what Imperial propaganda says it is. The official line treats Orcs as a problem, a significant, dangerous, militarily serious problem, but a problem without philosophical weight, without the kind of challenge that forces you to reconsider your assumptions about the universe. Bugs to be exterminated. The official position of the Adeptus Mechanicus mirrors this. Orc technology is inferior. Their relationship with machines is accidental rather than principled. Their results are the product of sheer brute quantity rather than actual competence. Orimedes is the living refutation of all of this. He is not bugs. He is not an accident. He is not the product of brute quantity. He is a specific, gifted individual who has taken the inheritance the Brain Boys gave him 60 million years ago and extended it to its natural limit through application, through experience, through the particular kind of intelligence that lives at the junction between instinct and genius. The second thing this means is that the Adeptus Mechanicus's relationship with their own history is more complicated than their official theology admits. The quest for knowledge is real. The urgency of it is real. The desperation behind the quest for STC databases is real, because the Mechanicus knows better than anyone how much has been lost and how inadequate the ritual procedure approach is as a substitute for genuine understanding. But that urgency has an uncomfortable corollary. If the goal is to recover what was lost, and the orcs have never lost the equivalent, then the orcs are in some specific sense closer to the original goal than the Mechanicus is. This is not a comfortable thought for anyone in the cult Mechanicus who thinks about it carefully, which is probably why it tends not to be thought about carefully, or at least not in official contexts. The third thing is the most speculative, but I think the most interesting. Orimedes has been working, apparently, for a very long time. He was Gazghkull's mechboy during the initial acquisition of teleporter technology from Nazdreg, which means he has been in this role for well over 50 years. He has worked through two of the most significant orc invasions in recent history. He has seen Gazghkull's vision of a unified orc race, moving from prophecy towards something that at least has the shape of a plan. What is he building now? The teleporter was the answer to the question of how you deliver an army to a defended planet faster than the defenses can respond. The submarines were the answer to the question of how you attack a target that thinks it is safe from any approach. Both of those answers required understanding the problem deeply enough to see the solution that was not obvious. The problem Gazghkull is now trying to solve. The problem of coordinating a galactic-scale orc crusade, of unifying millions of tribes and billions of individuals under a single strategic direction, is categorically harder than the problems Orimedes solved at Armageddon. It is the hardest logistical and organizational problem in the history of the orc race. The technology that would enable it, or that would give it the best possible chance of success, does not currently exist in anyone's arsenal. If Orimedes is working on it, and there is every reason to believe that he is, because a mechboy with this level of capability does not stop, cannot stop, any more than a river stops flowing, then somewhere in the depths of a space hulk, in a workshop that smells of machine oil and scorched metal, and the peculiar spores of orc biology, the greatest orc engineer in history is building towards something that the Imperium is not prepared for and may not see coming until it is already here. The Officio Assassinorum kill orders remain active. The best operatives in the Imperium are still trying to confirm whether Orimedes actually exists. They are, presumably, still failing. He leaves his fingerprints everywhere. On improved gargants, on teleporter arrays that break the laws of what teleportation is supposed to be capable of, on submersibles built from scavenged tanker hulls in a secret shipyard in a region the Imperials had decided was worthless, on the impossible ranges of his creations, on the solutions that should not work but do, on the evidence that 60 million years of genetic engineering by beings of unimaginable sophistication produced, among everything else, at least one individual who genuinely might deserve the name they have given him. A name borrowed from a man who said he could move the world with the right lever. Orimedes may be building that lever now. There is a question that I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most honest way to close this story. It is not a question with a clean answer, not in the lore, and not in the broader philosophical territory we have been moving through. If the Adeptus Mechanicus's quest for knowledge succeeded, if they recovered everything, if the STC was restored, if the full technical heritage of humanity's golden age was available to them again, what would they have? They would have the encoded knowledge of how to build everything that humanity in its prime could build. Knowledge in the genome, essentially, written in templates and databanks rather than DNA, but functionally equivalent. You put the right inputs in, and the machine tells you how to build things you do not otherwise understand. And the orcs already have that. They have had it for 60 million years, without the quest, without the mechanicus, without the rituals and the hierarchy and the theology and the kill orders and all the rest of it. They have it because their makers, beings far older than the first tech priests of Mars, far older than humanity's earliest relationship with fire, decided that the best way to preserve knowledge across cosmic timescales was to write it into something that could not be deleted. Not a database, not a library, not a tradition, a living species. The orcs carry the technical inheritance of 60-million-year-old masters in every cell of every mechboy who has ever lived. And the greatest of those mechboys, the ones who push that inheritance to its absolute furthest limit, who unlock the deepest layers of the encoded knowledge through decades of application and experimentation, and the particular kind of genius that is what the brain boys left in the bloodline for exactly this purpose. The greatest of those individuals are genuinely extraordinary. Orimedes is genuinely extraordinary, and he is still out there, building. If you made it all the way through this one, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of lore that I find endlessly fascinating because it rewards the longer look. You can know about Orimedes as a name in the Third War for Armageddon and move on, but if you stop and really trace what he represents, what his existence implies about the orcs, and about the Adeptus Mechanicus, and about the nature of knowledge in the 40k universe, there is so much more there. If this kind of deep dive lore content is what you're here for, please do consider subscribing to Q on 40k, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to explore next. There is a lot of galaxy out there, and a lot of dark corners full of fascinating, terrible, extraordinary things. We'll be going to all of them, slowly, at a pace that lets them breathe. Take care, stay curious, and remember, somewhere out there, an orc who should not exist is building something we are not ready for.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.